everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
But what's happened is that as offshore wind has become more prevalent in the future plans, particularly for the Atlantic coast of the U.S., folks who are going in there to operate facilities like Ørsted out of Denmark or RWE out of Germany have started to try to figure out where the components for these wind farms, the installations themselves, the service vessels, where they're going to come from. And we stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, all of the same skills, the same people, the same ports, the same assets, the same attitude that has allowed us to engineer, install, build, and service oil and gas rigs for decades, we can translate very easily into engineering, building, and servicing offshore wind installations. Because at the end of the day, you're building a big thing and putting it into the middle of the water. And so because of that, what's happened is that we have now developed partnerships with these companies and are evolving into the supply chain for wind farms in other parts of the country. So to be specific, the very first wind farm in America is the Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. That installation was 90% engineered and installed by Louisiana companies.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Michael Hecht, President and CEO of Greater New Orleans. Welcome to the show today.
Great, Scott. Thanks for having me here. Appreciate it.
So in your past life, Michael, you worked for Michael Bloomberg during his NYC mayorship. I wonder what was that like and what insights did you gain specifically from running the post 9/11 small business program?
Yeah, it was, an outstanding experience. I think that Mayor Bloomberg, particularly in his first term coming out of 9/11, was probably one of the most able civic leaders I ever have been able to work with. I think what was so impressive about Mayor Mike is that he was able to deal with the immediate tactical things like creating a New York that was safe and that people wanted to come back to, even while he was doing visionary things like Tech Island, like Cornell Island out at Roosevelt Island. And so that really impressed me. In my particular role where I was trying to help small businesses come back after 9/11, and I was working with Dan Doctoroff on that. What I was most impressed by was, so we had a grant and loan program, and I was going to be charging interest for the loans. And Dan Doctoroff said, why are we charging any interest to these people? It's not their fault. So we did a 0 interest loan program for small businesses. And the payback rate on those loans that were just based on kind of character lending was between 92 and 94%. And we saw something similar when I ran an analogous program in Louisiana after Katrina. And it just showed me that there's such a pride in the small business community that that sense of responsibility was enough to drive a higher repay rate on these loans than actually even retail banks typically see with more conventionally structured loan products.
That is a profound insight. It really is. And it speaks to the self-accountability and enforcement. And of course, we've seen lots of similar types of stories around micro-lending.
Exactly.
In a kind of a tribal self-enforcing mechanism fashion. So very exciting stuff. And I think one of the things that I think took away is that you talked about how Mayor Mike was able to handle both the kind of the tactical short term, but also the longer term strategic things. And I think that's a very key topic that we're going to be talking about as we get into Louisiana. But before that, let's talk about the importance of small businesses and how and why are they the backbone of any regional economy?
New Orleans is a great example of this. Small businesses, we know the statistics provide the vast amount of the majority in the country of employment in the country, and particularly for women and people of color. So they're a very important source of employment. kind of by definition, they're the wellsprings of innovation. And innovation is how a nation develops productivity. And productivity is really the only way that a nation thrives over time and achieves goals like mobility and equity. But what small businesses also provide, which is often overlooked, and we know it in New Orleans and also in New York City to some degree, is they provide culture. When you go down a great main street, and this is something that a great New Yorker like a Jane Jacobs would have observed decades ago, it's the retail establishments, the businesses, the haberdasheries, the restaurants that are providing the color, the culture, the sense of community, the sense of place. And so when I think about small businesses, I'm not just thinking about the direct benefit of jobs and taxes and wealth creation. I'm also thinking about how they create the cultural amenity that attracts tourists, that makes people want to live in a place. And if you don't have that, and you just have big box, for example, and nothing against the Targets and IKEAs of the world, you lose that culture and authenticity. And I think you lose a lot of attractiveness of the urban environment.
This is such an excellent point that I don't feel that many people rarely articulate. Because when we go to New York or Louisiana or any parts of the world, what we're interacting and experiencing, that texture, what represents or gets manifested as that particular city or region, are exactly the small businesses, exactly the types of things that you're talking about. That's what we see and interact and touch and feel. So without that, it just becomes a cookie cutter approach. Now, I want to ask you about Louisiana, because some of our listeners, though they have some ideas, probably don't understand the richness. And if you could help us characterize the Southeast Louisiana in particular.
It's a fascinating place. I often tell people that New Orleans is not really an American city. It's the northernmost Caribbean city. It's got a very specific cultural and anthropological history as a port city, as the largest slave port in America, and also as the home of the exiles from the Haitian slave revolt of 1791. And so because of all of that, we've got this mixture of Afro-Caribbean and European heritage, which makes New Orleans a very cosmopolitan place. But also because of our location and history, we've got a history of innovation, and that's often overlooked. People know us for our food, know us for our music, know us for Mardi Gras. What they don't realize is that because it's been a challenge to live here from its founding 300 years ago, and even before that, that the people who have survived and thrived here have been innovative. And so innovations that have not only served South Louisiana, but the world have come out of New Orleans. A great example of that, Scott, that people don't know about is that it was a Scottish inventor named Andrew Higgins, who is known for his the number of patents and the amount of scotch that he drank every day, that saved the free world in World War II, because he took a boat that he used to take into the swamp to survey oil and gas, added on an innovation he saw in Japan by putting a front loader on it, and created the Higgins boat that allowed us to land in Normandy. And basically, it was for VE Day and free Europe. And General Eisenhower said that Andrew Higgins saved the free world. That same place where Higgins built his boats, we're now designing and testing the longest windmill blades in the world for GE, and building the largest rocket in human history that's going to put the first woman and person of color on the moon by 2025. This is all part of the story of South Louisiana that, frankly, we just haven't done a good job of telling over the years.
Beautiful and very colorful historical context. And thank you for providing that, because I think, the thing that comes to mind is this concept of comparative advantage in economics. Mm-hmm. And the notion that Louisiana is so unique that it cannot be easily replicated elsewhere. And that goes for also challenges that's been turned into opportunities. There, you guys get a lot of hurricane and high wind, and being able to actually utilize those challenges to actually create a new industry around this offshore wind, that's pretty mind-boggling. But I think the other thing is, if you could talk just briefly about how the backdrop of oil and gas sector in Louisiana actually has been an asset in terms of capabilities for Louisiana to be able to actually pivot to wind and green hydrogen.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This sounds counterintuitive until you just have it explained, then it makes perfect sense. So Louisiana has been an oil and gas state for decades. The reason why the New Orleans Saints colors are black and gold is that they were owned by an oil man, and so he made them those colors because oil is called black gold. So it's very much a part of our fabric. It very much is part of our economic model. Standard Oil, which created the Rockefeller fortune, really controlled the state for many years. It really is part of our past. But what's happened is that as offshore wind has become more prevalent in the future plans, particularly for the Atlantic coast of the US, folks who are going in there to operate facilities like Ørsted out of Denmark or RWE out of Germany have started to try to figure out where the components for these wind farms, the installations themselves, the service vessels, where they're going to come from. And we stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, all of the same skills, the same people, the same ports, the same assets, the same attitude that has allowed us to engineer, install, build, and service oil and gas rigs for decades, we can translate very easily into engineering, building, and servicing offshore wind installations. Because at the end of the day, you're building a big thing and putting it into the middle of the water. And so because of that, what's happened is that we have now developed partnerships with these companies and are evolving into the supply chain for wind farms in other parts of the country. So to be specific, the very first wind farm in America is the Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. That installation was 90% engineered and installed by Louisiana companies. And so, I don't know, to use a California analogy, we're not necessarily looking for gold up front, although we will be putting wind into the Gulf. Right now, we are selling shovels to the gold miners. And frankly, and you know this from your background in economics, that's the best model, right? Is to be the one providing the batteries to the EV car makers, not making the cars themselves.
Yeah, I think the Block Island Wind Farm is a great example that really helps to kind of cement the capabilities that Louisiana know-how can really provide. And that's very exciting. And the fact that it's domestic versus having to look overseas for that capability is very exciting. So talk to us about specifically some of these opportunities and projects that your organization is ushering, such as, for example, the GNO Wind, as well as the H2 the Future.
Thank you. Well, GNO Wind is our consortium of everybody involved in offshore wind, and that's now over 250 members, including universities, big oil and gas majors like Shell and Chevron, wind companies like Ørsted and RWE, and it's really our user group. But let me pivot to what you just said about H2 the Future, because this is around hydrogen, and this is a very exciting opportunity. Hydrogen is the most common element on Earth. People think about it as a fuel source, but it also has a very important industrial use as a feedstock. The best example of that in Louisiana is that we make a lot of fertilizer that helps feed the world. That fertilizer has ammonia as a key ingredient. Ammonia is made from hydrogen significantly. That hydrogen traditionally has been made by what's called cracking natural gas, by splitting up natural gas, which creates hydrogen, but also releases carbon into the atmosphere. And that's called gray hydrogen. So what we are going to be doing here is what you talked about before, is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is not made from natural gas, it's made from water. So the only thing that is emitted into the atmosphere is pure oxygen. And if you can split up the water using what's called an electrolyzer with a zero carbon process like wind power, then you've created a chemically identical hydrogen molecule, but you've done it with zero carbon. And so by using green hydrogen, we're going to be able to continue to make the ammonia, to make the fertilizer, to feed the world. But according to McKinsey, we're going to be able to reduce our emissions by 70%. And so that's the H to the Future project, for which we just got a $75 million grant from the Department of Commerce.
So this is a great example and a future case study. And the reason I say that is many of the chemical feedstock that you're talking about, the fertilizers, the oil refinery, the steel, the coastal and river vessels to long haul transportation, many of these represents really historically heavy industries that cannot get away from burning oil and gas just because of the nature of it. So the fact that you guys are able to turn this into a green hydrogen that's powered by offshore wind that then goes to this green hydrogen production that uses the electrolyzer plant to then put this through a pipeline to feed it to these various industries in Louisiana. That's exactly what we're looking for. That's very, very exciting. So talk to us about what the $75 million investment means and what's the time frame for this to become a reality?
Well, the clock is ticking on the time frame because Department of Commerce has given us 4 years to get it done. So it's running. There are 5 different areas of this. One has to do with university research. So we're giving money to our universities to develop more efficient electrolyzers. The second is around business development, which is us bringing in green hydrogen and other clean energy companies from around the world and having them see Louisiana as their base. The third part of that is around workforce development, because we have an economic and frankly a political and moral obligation to train our workers who have been in oil and gas to now move into the energy transition. The fourth part of this involves something called Nexus, which is the new energy center of the U.S., which is going to be the physical headquarters for the energy transition. We think for the Gulf South and all of the United States. That's at the University of New Orleans. And then finally, as a demonstration project, we are going to have the first zero emission tugboats in America plying the Mississippi out of the port of South Louisiana using green hydrogen that we are producing through this project to demonstrate kind of an end-to-end use case for this. Right now, we've
very
got,
exciting, very exciting. But please continue.
No, it's what's we are trying to catalyze what's happening naturally. And I think it's important for your viewers that we explain. We talked about gray hydrogen, which is dirty. We talked about green hydrogen, which is made from water. We should also mention blue hydrogen because we have billions of dollars of blue hydrogen being invested in as well, in large part because of the Inflation Reduction Act. Blue hydrogen is when you're emitting carbon through traditional processes, but then you are capturing it either in the process or out of the air, and then you're either injecting it deep underground forever or using it for another purpose, so it never gets into the atmosphere. And this is a process that's supported by everybody from the oil and gas companies to the United Nations. You can get big credits for it now in the IRA, and that's going to be a bridge for the country, and a lot of that's happening here as well.
I'm really glad that you also brought up blue hydrogen because of the fact that you're right. The incentives, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, has significantly jumped. I think it was around 180 for those that don't have a market to, I think, 150 or 130 for those that are used for other sources to carbon sequester these things. That's very exciting. Now, one of the things I think I'm really focusing on is the strategic geolocation of Louisiana and what it means to be both a test bed for startups and those that are looking to experiment and develop R&D, but also this notion of labor force that's local labor force, but also labor force that's specialized that are coming from abroad and domestically. The center of excellence, what does that mean, and how do you envision your organization really helping to cement that from kind of a broad strategy to reality? And again, I know you talked about some of those initiatives already.
The importance of having a physical center, I think, is twofold. One is that you need a place where you can have these moments of serendipity, where researchers and industry and students can come together and collaborate, or even just have a coffee or a beer together. We know from places like Carnegie Mellon, which you know, or MIT, that having these physical campuses where you get this interaction of talent is how you create the social capital that leads to inventiveness and productivity. So we wanted to have a physical space. The second thing is that, I'll give you 3 things. The second thing is that we know that on the most successful campuses today, whether again it's Carnegie or it's at ASU or at Penn, you have this intermingling of educational and private sector interests. You're making this, the private sector companies are investing in programs. At Carnegie, you could talk about autonomous vehicles as a way of driving innovation and kind of creating their own test bed. And so we wanted to create that at the University of New Orleans as well. But finally, we thought that for the rest of the world, for the media, we needed to have a physical place that we could put on podcast, that we could bring the media to, that we could bring visitors to say this is where it's happening. Because one of our challenges that we have, and we talked about this at the beginning, is that New Orleans and Louisiana are well beloved, but they're well beloved for music, food, and Mardi Gras, not for innovation, not for clean energy. And so I think we need something that almost stands as a monument or museum to make it visceral for people that this is actually happening in Louisiana right now. And that's why we created the Nexus Center.
Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent point, because we've had other NGOs and similar types of organizations that represent certain regional economic zones or blocks. And they all have their imperatives or objectives and goals in mind. But the same sets of salient strength of a particular region can also work against you as well. Mm-hmm. So how do you overcome some of the challenges, the perception that perhaps maybe some of the labor force are less skilled or less educated? What are some of the other types of challenges that you need to overcome besides being able to install a physical location?
Yeah, so one is, the workforce in Louisiana, I know from personal experience as well as just from the numbers, is one of the most productive and diligent and innovative in the country. And again, that's a product of having to have survived in a challenging environment. And the way that you overcome that is just by showing people and having them see, touch, feel, and talk. But there's something actually even more interesting than that I want to touch on. The Louisiana is blessed with a geology and human infrastructure, so the river or 6 Class 1 railroads that are the envy of the country and the world. We are truly more blessed with natural resources than maybe any other place in America and amongst the best in the world. But that's also led to something that, I don't know if this is a real economic term, but that I call the curse of riches. And that is that places that are blessed with enormous natural resources can tend over time to develop commodity-based economies that don't have to have the best structures in order to increase productivity. And so it works for a while and then they get surpassed. And I would argue that that's why New Orleans in the past was surpassed by a Houston or an Atlanta, cities that have less natural resources, or why a country like a Singapore or a Norway or an Israel might do better than a Nigeria. Being blessed, for example, with hydrocarbons can create a lot of wealth, but it doesn't necessarily create an imperative to put in the structures to maximize the human potential of your population or create the rules to encourage innovation and future growth beyond those commodities. So some of what we're trying to do in Louisiana is to recognize and leverage our blessings, but also not be trapped by them.
Now, in your past, you have worked at the state and city levels in terms of creating programs, and it's about creating the right incentive structure.
Right.
So as you think about both your organization, but more broadly at the state level, what's being done or what is being proposed so that you can create an economic zone that is very favorable for researchers, for developers, startups, and talent to want to converge?
So we have 2 types of incentives in Louisiana. Some are ones that I call just kind of leveling the playing field incentives, and we're not going to talk about them because they're ones that we have because Texas has them. The ones that are more interesting are the strategic incentives. So, for example, one of our goals is to develop a real tech sector specifically around video games. And so in order to catalyze that, we have the best video game and software incentive in North America, arguably. You get 25% of your money back in cash if you do programming in Louisiana or New Orleans. As a result of that, for example, we now have a Microsoft Xbox studio. We have a company that's doing the programming for Fortnite. the most popular video game in the world. And the gentleman who started the largest massively multiplayer online game of all time has recently opened a studio here. That's because of that software incentive. In R&D, we also have a very good R&D incentive that, depending on the size of your company, can give you up to 40% of your investment back for early research and development. We have other incentives like that, including an angel investor tax credit. These are all meant to be catalytic incentives that give an industry a start. Over time, you get enough critical mass that you become like a Silicon Valley or like a Boston, and you don't need the incentives anymore because there's a benefit that you get of the talent in companies. But in early stages, these tactical incentives can be important.
Well, I'm very impressed by this conversation. We're zigzagging from wind to green energy, ammonia to gaming. Now, my last question is the fact that, again, from a regional area, regional domestic production of clean energy, and then, of course, the green hydrogen and the feedstock into ammonia, for example, are very exciting. But the real question that I have is there an opportunity for export? Meaning, could we create surplus so that we as a country can actually start to export green hydrogen in the form of ammonia, liquid hydrocarbons or ammonia, to other countries that need it?
Yeah, so the answer is absolutely yes. The challenge there is that we've got to have a technology technologies that mean that the cost delta of us producing and transporting makes it less expensive than in other places. Now, there is a very good case study of that right now, which is very important, and that is liquefied natural gas. We're big producers of LNG because of our shale formations. If you look at Europe, pre-Ukraine, Europe and particularly Germany were buying most of their natural gas from Russia and Putin. It was both convenient, and it was also part of a Ostpolitik strategy of trying to create stability with Russia. That obviously didn't work. It turned out that buying gas from Russia was just feeding the war machine and allowing the aggression in Ukraine. So now they're buying LNG from Louisiana, and we're providing over 50% to Europe. As a result of that, the largest project financing in world history is being built right now in Plaquemines Parish, 20 miles south of where I'm sitting. It's a $22 billion project that is going to provide LNG today to places like France and Germany, and then tomorrow actually to China and Asia. And so you're getting three benefits. We're getting massive investments in job creation. Europe is getting, or the world is getting geostability because Europe is able to purchase and meet their needs from an ally. And then when we're able to switch over to Asia, that is going to allow Asia to switch off of coal, which is bad for the entire planet, and more onto natural gas, which is a lower impact hydrocarbon. So I think that when there is an economic and geopolitical imperative for our exports to be bought by the rest of the world, as we can see from this $22 billion project, the money and the operations will fall into place.
Great news. Very exciting initiative underway. And with that, I have been joined by Michael Hecht, President and CEO of Greater New Orleans. Thank you for joining.
Scott, thank you for the time. Appreciate you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.